When last we left off, we had talked about the role that the Great Reforms played in setting a foundation for future development, industrial, economic, and social development in the Russian Empire. We talked about the important role of the Crimean War as a watershed in forcing the hand of the autocracy to undertake a series of fundamental reforms, most importantly the emancipation of the serfs, as a way then of trying to reinvigorate the nation and to bring Russia up to speed with the whirlwind changes that had been underway in Western Europe for about the past 30 years. Products of the French Revolution, to be certain, but from a technical and from an industrial standpoint, also the Industrial Revolution. One of the things the Tsarist autocracy is, one of the things that the autocracy is facing in the 1860s is a problem that's really not dissimilar to the one that Peter the Great faced at the turn of the 18th century. And that was how to go about building the institutions and providing the impetus to generate the internal energy, the internal foundations for the establishment of a new, more vibrant Russian polity. Reform the military, reform industry, bring in Western expertise, bring in Western technology once again. So we've fallen back here to a pattern that we've seen this semester in charting the growth and the development of the autocracy. All of those things are well and good. You can bring in different institutions, you can bring in technicians, you can bring in railroads, you can bring in steamships. One of the problems that Russia would face in the middle of the 19th century is a problem that it had faced earlier and that it's going to face as we see when we turn to the Soviet Union if you're in the class next semester. That problem concerns internal Russian attitudes. The attitudes of the Russian educated population to the kinds of reforms, the kinds of changes that are taking place in the West. One of the key foundations for the Industrial Revolution was a spirit of entrepreneurial energy that was present in Great Britain, that was certainly present in the United States. And I haven't said much about the United States so far in this class. We're going to talk about the United States in much more detail for a little bit next week. Talk about the way in which the United States experiences its technological and industrial growth spurt in the 1880s and the 1890s. It actually precedes that a little bit, 1860s and 1870s, but the point is made. There is an appreciation and an understanding that entrepreneurial energy, that the act of undertaking business as part of that free market capitalist system that has already established itself as a result of the Industrial Revolution, that is a cardinal constituent element of progress and development. But Russian attitudes, even among the educated elite, even among those who identify themselves as Westernizers, those attitudes were not always charitable and not always favorable when looking at the issue of specifically entrepreneurial activity. Recall that I talked about the rise of the Russian intelligentsia during the decade of the late 1820s to the late 1830s. Talked about the rise of these two groups, the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. The Westernizers trying to adopt and embrace the accoutrements of Western development. The Slavophiles believing that Russia's future lay in Russia's past, in a return to traditional values like the commune, a return to collectivist aspirations. Both sides, however, reject the autocratic state as it was established by Peter the Great. One of the curious things about the Slavophil tradition, of course, is that individuals like Kireevsky and Khomyakov disdained individualism. They did not appreciate competition, and they viewed market uncertainty as a destructive element that threatened traditional values and customs, the values and customs of the peasant commune. Their attitude was part of a general antipathy towards emerging European institutions and policies that came of age in Russia in the 1850s and the 1860s. What's curious about the Slavophiles in this regard is that this disdain for profit, this disdain for what we would call business activity, wasn't simply limited to the Slavophiles themselves. It was a widespread element across Russian society. To be certain, there were Russian entrepreneurs. There were successful Russian businessmen. We're going to meet some of these folks beginning next week and the week after that. We're going to talk about the ways in which Russians, given an opportunity where every bit is inventive, every bit is creative, and every bit is able to generate profit, as their peers were, say, in Germany or in Britain or in the United States. But as a general rule of thumb, Russian cultural values came to view that kind of acquisitive, and acquisitional activity as somehow being dirty or money grubbing. Even among the westernizers in the 1840s and the 1850s, those who wanted to bring in European political institutions, parliaments and constitutions and some form of representative democracy, even for many of those folks, the idea of entrepreneurial business practices associated with the rising middle class or the bourgeoisie, those things were viewed as somehow being distasteful. There's no better example of this attitude than this fellow, a guy by the name of Vasili Botkin, who was the son of a wealthy merchant. So he's born into money. And he's born into money not of the nobility, but he's born into the money coming from out of the merchant class. In the 1840s, Botkin was a member of one of those circles. I had mentioned the Kruzhok, the university circle, as being really central here to intellectual life during the late 1830s and the 1840s. Botkin was a member of one of the most prominent. I think I had mentioned the Stankiewicz circle a couple of weeks ago. He was among them. And he emerges during the 1840s really as a quintessential example of the first generation of Russian westernizers. He embraces the idea that Russia needs change after the fashion of Europe. He's going to devote the better part of the decade of the 1840s to devising what he calls a practical philosophy that is aimed at identifying the underlying laws governing industrial development. In other words, by applying himself to the study of the past, to the study of Western institutions, to the emergence of Western industry and Western business, what Botkin hopes to do, in sort of an Enlightenment era, sort of throwback idea, is by observing and studying, he can unlock the secrets to how to bring about this kind of technological and industrial development to Russia as well. And what Botkin is going to conclude, ultimately, is that what Russia needs is more risk takers. Russia needs more innovation. Russia needs a middle class that will create the energy, the dynamism, the inventions in Russia that emerging members of the European middle class had done in Europe previously. And for Botkin, that would be people like our friend James Watt, right, who took Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric steam engine and transformed it into a usable engine that could not only pump water out of a coal mine, but that could fuel an entire revolution in industry. What had driven James Watt? Well, it's innovation. It's a desire to take risk, and in the process of taking risks, devise new inventions that are going to help not only Great Britain, but ultimately are going to diffuse throughout the world and help everybody. This, Botkin thinks, is exactly what Russia needs. More invention. In 1846, he's writing out his ideas. He goes so far as to say, in print, "Heaven grant us our own bourgeoisie." But even as he acknowledges the European middle class's role in advancing technological and economic progress, Botkin qualifies that statement, continuing, I quote, "I am by no means an admirer of the bourgeoisie. Its crudeness, its vulgarity offend me as much as anyone else. My whole sympathy is without question on the side of the workers, the downtrodden classes." That's a very curious thing to say for someone who in the 1840s is embracing this idea of Western liberalism, at least on the surface. What Botkin wants is he wants, as a Russian quote-unquote liberal, he wants all of the accoutrements, all the outward forms of Western innovation. What he doesn't want, however, are the social values and attitudes that he associates with those innovative entrepreneurial elements in Western Europe and the United States, the middle classes or the so-called bourgeoisie. This antipathy towards the bourgeoisie, toward those who make money, those engaged in business, is going to be a typical feature of Russian culture, and specifically Russian technological culture, throughout up until the end of the Tsarist Empire. It will return in force, this antipathy, of course, during the Soviet period as well. If you have self-identified Westernizers and liberals like Botkin, qualifying their support for the bourgeoisie, these kinds of statements didn't bode well for the future of Russian liberalism. And I mean liberalism here after the fashion that we discussed it a few weeks back. Liberalism of the sort of mid-19th century type that emerges in figures like Alexis de Tocqueville, Henry Adams at the end of the 19th century in the United States context. Entrepreneurs, businessmen who are looking to expand and to grow industry as a way of improving the quality of life, not only for themselves, but in the process of doing so, extending the bounties of progress to all around them. Russian antipathy to market competition, to personal profit, to calculated risk and other so-called bourgeois principles would lead, in fact, many members of the westernizing intelligentsia to move away from European-style liberalism after the fashion of an Alexis de Tocqueville and to embrace what was by the 1840s and the 1850s the new rising ideology in Europe, and that was the ideology of socialism. Recall a couple of weeks ago I had mentioned that one of the curious things about Russian intellectual life in the 1830s and 1840s, and one of the characteristic traits of the Russian intelligentsia, this group of thinking, educated elites who are generally opposed to the autocracy and are trying to find something to latch onto. Generation after generation, decade after decade, as new ideas arise in Europe, they end up being adopted in whole or in part in Russia without much critical thinking. They tend to be embraced and then applied to the Russian context. The exact same thing is going to take place with regards to socialism. But what's interesting here is the figure who brings socialism to Russia. He's a Russian, but he's living outside of the empire. And he's going to, in the process of bringing socialism to Russia, he's going to place a peculiar twist on socialism. That individual is a fellow by the name of Alexander Herzen, one of the truly great thinkers in the Russian intellectual tradition, especially that of the mid to second half of the 19th century. Herzen was the illegitimate son of a wealthy and highly cultured provincial noble, and he's a prototypical representative of that member of the Russian intelligentsia that came of age during the Romantic 1830s. He was intellectually gifted, he was self-assured, he was also highly self-conscious. Deeply engaged in contemporary philosophical debates, he was utterly frustrated by the restrictive atmosphere of the reign of Nicholas I. He hated the censorship, he hated orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. He hated the venal ways of the autocratic bureaucracy. He would, as a young man in 1834, at the age of 22, he was engaged in one of those kruzhki, in one of those discussion circles at Moscow University. And it's there, as a leader of a university discussion circle, that he is going to be arrested for peddling subversive ideas, now in the repressive atmosphere of Nicholas I's early reign. He's exiled to the provinces. And it is there over a period of 5 years, while in exile, he's going to work as a petty provincial clerk. And in that capacity, he's going to come into contact with the day-to-day venality of the czarist bureaucracy. He sees the pettiness, the pettifoggery, the thick-headedness, all the bad things that you can think about a bureaucratic entity, Herzen encounters out in the provinces. The mundane brutality of serf owners towards their peasants. He comes to feel that he's been corrupted, quote, by the vulgar remarks, dirty people, mean ideas, and coarse emotions, that he's encountering on a regular basis. And he grows in the process further alienated from his surroundings. To Herzen's good fortune, he ends up inheriting his family's wealth. So that by the time that his period of exile ends, he receives his father's fortune when his father dies in 1847, and he now has the wherewithal, he has the financial ability to say, to heck with this, I'm leaving. And he packs up, having returned from exile, he packs up his possessions and he departs Russia. He will never return. He's going to spend the remainder of his life, 33 odd years, living abroad, primarily in London. And it's from once he's abroad, Herzen is able to take advantage of the liberty that he had enjoyed in the West, that liberty that he didn't have under the autocratic system. And having significant freedom of speech, significant freedom of the press, enjoying all the normal liberties that British citizens and subjects would possess, Herzen is going to begin undertaking the process of arguing for the desperate need to reform Russia from within. Herzen lives in London from 1852 until 1863. And while in London, he's able to draw upon the technical support of a group of Polish nationalists in exile. And these are Polish nationalists who fled the Russian Empire under the Kingdom of Poland as a constituent element. Polish nationalist aspirations have been crushed twice by Nicholas, once in 1830 and again in 1848. The Poles who can go into exile, they set up shop in Russia and in London. Herzen comes to London, and who does he meet? He meets Poles. The Poles hate the autocracy as much as he does. So the Poles are going to lend him a great deal of support in setting up a typography. Along with the aid granted by the Poles, Herzen establishes something that comes to be known as the Free Russian Press. This is the very first uncensored and truly independent media forum for Russian public opinion. Note the irony. Where does it arise? In London, as a result of Herzen's own voluntary exile. Okay. But he's going to print things in London where he has freedom of the speech, or relative freedom of speech, freedom from censorship. The British government doesn't give a damn what he's writing. So what he's going to do is he's going to use his typography, his Free Russian Press, to launch a series of journals that are designed, well, initially to publish his own ideas, his own literary production, and informative pamphlets. And these are going to focus on European events and the conditions as he sees them in Russia, because he's reading now. He's getting letters from his friends and acquaintances back at home. He's also following along in the British press. Subsequently, he is going to launch an oppositional journal called the Polar Star. The Polar Star. It's launched in 1855. And the name and the illustration that appears on the edition of the first cover should give you an intimation here of what Herzen is all about. Polar Star was the name of a literary journal earlier established by a fellow by the name of Kondraty Rylyaev. Who was Kondraty Rylyaev? He was one of the leading members of the Decembrist conspiracy, 1825. I talked about him several weeks ago. Okay. Herzen is absolutely convinced that the Decembrist uprising was the first blow, aimed to strike the first blow against hated autocracy. Okay. So he's going to name this opposition journal in the honor of the journal established by the Decembrist conspirator Rylyaev. In 1857, he's going to publish a second journal known simply as The Bell, or the Tocsin. You sound the bell, sound the alarm. This would provide Herzen with a regular platform for expounding his political views. In the late 1850s, he's calling for the abolition of serfdom. He's calling for the creation of freedom of speech in Russia, the end of corporal punishment, all the kinds of reforms that are eventually going to come into being in the autocratic empire, although some earlier, some later. Herzen gathers information. He understands what's going on in Russia because he's receiving letters, denunciations, secret documents are being smuggled to him in London, and he's printing what he's being given in these two journals. The periodical, meanwhile, are being smuggled. They're being printed in London and smuggled into Russia. And Russians are getting them and they're writing them down, and these things are passing hand to hand, kind of like Radishev's journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow had done after its publication in 1790. Recall I told you that only about a dozen or so of those are actually published, and the actual hard copies that are passed around, and people pay good money just to have an opportunity to read it, to have it for a night or so before they pass it on to someone else. So now we have an underground, subversive, even revolutionary literature that's percolating, or at least circulating amongst members of Russian educated opinion in the late 50s and throughout the 1860s. All being published abroad, being smuggled back into London by Herzen, who's in self-imposed exile. So the Free Russian Press is going to establish a tradition of subversive publishing. This is going to be carried on into the 21st century. It's alive today, only it takes form on the internet, where you have opponents of the Putin regime writing with a little bit more freedom than Herzen may have had, a little bit more freedom than the Soviet dissidents had in the 1960s, but these things too may be temporary, right? As the Russian government, as the Chinese government, and other governments look to crack down on internet access as a way of censoring and controlling opinions they don't like. But here is the origin of a 100-year-plus history of subversive publishing in Russia. Now, in more immediately, Herzen's publications are important because Herzen, in the course of publishing these journals, is going to establish a broad framework for what comes to be known as Russian socialist thought. Russian socialist thought. Herzen is the one who's going to introduce socialist concepts to the Russian educated elite. And his views are very, very curious. Herzen's in London. He enjoys free press. Herzen we would identify as someone who would embrace the westernizer tradition. But Herzen's views on socialism are deeply, deeply influenced by the Slavophiles. Or at least by ideas, I should say, that the Slavophiles had first identified. Like Khomyakov, like Kireevsky, Herzen is going to filter his experience through an investigation of the Russian peasantry, He is going to draw upon the principles of the peasant commune as being, he believes, a kind of natural socialism, that already exists in Russia. Now, the contemporary atmosphere in Russia in the 1850s, especially the early 1850s, prior to the Crimean War, appall Herzen to the very quick of his being. He once famously characterizes Nicholas I. He calls Nicholas I Genghis Khan with a telegraph. And by the late mid-1850s, Russia's got telegraphs. So here you have this Mongol ruler, right? Only what differentiates Nicholas I from the Mongol ruler, the fact that Nicholas I has modern technology. What's ironic, though, about Herzen is although he's opposed to the Russian autocracy, despite the fact that he's a westernizer, despite the fact that he's living in London and he's enjoying all the accoutrements and freedoms of British liberal society, he is utterly convinced that the British bourgeoisie, like the European bourgeoisie in general, is hypocritical and venal. Like Vasili Botkin, one of his contemporaries, he rejects the bourgeoisie. And he is convinced that what Russia needs to do is to avoid the money-grubbing, self-absorbed, materialist characteristics that he believes characterizes the European bourgeoisie. He's also convinced that Russia has a special path, that Russia is going to show the world a different, better way to construct a modern civilization. So building upon ideas that had originated with Khomyakov and Kireevsky and the Slavophiles, Herzen is going to identify the peasant commune, that obshchina, or the mir, as the embryonic stage. We talked about Romanticism and how the Romantics view society as an organic thing, a living, breathing entity. Herzen sees the embryo, the egg of Russian socialism arising out of the peasant commune. He believes the peasant commune represents a sort of natural socialism, a natural socialism from which the Europeans had a great deal to learn. And Herzen's writings about the commune as a seedbed for Russian socialism are going to strike a chord. It's going to become really the foundation for an entire group of revolutionaries. I'm going to talk about them briefly at the end of our time together tonight. We'll pick up on this theme then next week. They come to be known as the populists. The word in Russian, narodniki. The Russian word narod means people, das Volk, right, in the German sense, the collective people. So our Russian populists, or our narodniki, they are going to derive their inspiration from what Herzen is writing in the late 1850s and the early 1860s. And the narodniki are going to ultimately go to the people in the summer in the early 1870s. Young educated men and some young educated women are going to leave university, they're going to leave their polytechnic institutes, and they're going to go out into the village, into the countryside, and in this upsurge of what do you want to call it, idealism, mixed with a great deal of naivete, they're going to go out there and they're going to try and embrace and teach the people, teach them, educate them, teach them how to read, teach them about sanitary conditions, try and lift up their level of cultural development. And for the most part, the peasants are going to look at them and think to themselves, why are these strangers here? Peasants don't trust them. Again, as I said last week, the peasants live in a world all to their own. Young university students going off to do good deeds. It's not just an American thing. The Russians are going to do it. Well, it has something to do with being, I guess, 20-something. The world is your oyster. Everything is in front of you. And that is true. Maybe you will make the world a better place. Herzen certainly thought he was going to. And so did those members of the Russian populist movement. While the seeds of Russian socialism are being established, or being sown by Herzen in the late 1850s and the early 1860s, we're going to come back to socialism. There are a whole host of other things that are going on in and around Europe at the middle of the 19th century. Right around the time, the years leading up to the Crimean War and the aftermath of the Crimean War. As I had mentioned a couple of weeks back, Europe now is constantly changing, is constantly reinventing itself. New ideologies are coming to the fore, new technologies, new social movements. Europe is in this process of dynamic evolution, dynamic transformation and change. Where it is going, no one quite seems to know. No one quite seems to know. But those entrepreneurial forces, those money-grubbing bourgeois forces that Russians like Botkin and Herzen are so much opposed to, they are, by the 1850s and the 1860s, helping the Europeans to achieve new and greater heights of scientific and technological advance. And indeed, the 25 years or so that follow mid-century, the period from about 1850 to 1875, will witness in Europe and in the United States rapidly growing speed and scale of economic and social transformations. These social transformations are in turn tied to new discoveries in the sciences, and the development of new wondrous technological contrivances. Arguably the greatest of all the technological devices of the mid-19th century was the railroad. The railroad. I mentioned its origin in the 1830s with the rocket. By the 1850s and the 1860s, rail empires and rail networks had spread across a very large portion of the European continent. Still largely, Great Britain is the one that has the most concentrated rail network, but the railroad was becoming an increasingly everyday aspect of European lives by the 1850s and the 1860s. With steam as a source of its energy, gradual improvements are going to be made to the engines, to the locomotives, to the undercarriages. The growing efficiency, the growing power and utility of the railroad would broaden its use to include not only steam engines, but in time, steam engines are going to have steam plows, steamboats, steam locomotives. This new form of energy, steam, would remake the world through its practical applications. It would inspire contemporaries to flights of enthusiasm, suggesting increasingly that humankind had mastered the natural world and was imposing its will upon Mother Nature. Among all the various products of the industrial age, it's the railroad that stands apart in the middle of the 19th century because it generated a kind of awe and admiration among European and American spectators that no other technology would match. No other technology would match. At least not until the early 20th century, when the airplane comes to take pride of place among the various new technological wonders that humanity has invented. In Germany, in Britain, in France, and in the emerging United States, the railroad would become the quintessential symbol of progress by the 1850s and the 1860s. And I'm going to show you here, as I'm talking about the railway, a series of paintings from this period in European history. And the fact that there are so many paintings, major artists, in this case Claude Monet, one of the great Impressionist artists of the 19th century, why are they painting railways? Why are they painting railway cars? Because there's something about this technology that they find fascinating, at times invigorating and even sublime. So the railroad is not simply a technological device, it inspires wonder, it inspires awe. The revolutionary importance of the railroad is all but lost to us today. You know, the only thing a train does is it annoys us as you're sitting by the tracks waiting for it to pass because you're in a hurry to go wherever you're going. Especially like in a one-horse town where the train comes right to the middle of it. Not that we would know anything about that. But for contemporaries in the 19th century in Europe and the United States, The advent of the railroad represented the most complete transformation of human existence, certainly the most complete transformation of transportation, then since the moment the first nomadic tribes had got up and moved and then settled down in a single spot to grow grain and raise cattle. The railroad, in effect, upended history. It did so by uprooting humankind and by transforming its members, once again, into types of nomads. It is all but impossible to state the significance, the broader cultural significance that emerged out of the process of the construction of rail networks in Western Europe, Central Europe, and the United States. I mean, in the United States, if you take a course in American history, modern American history, 1877 to the present, at least some portion of that discussion early in the semester has to be devoted to the railway and the way in which the railway was so important in cutting off the American frontier, ending the frontier, joining the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific via the transcontinental railway that's completed in 1869. That act, final act in 1869, the opening of the transcontinental railway, meant that you could travel across the entire width of a continent in only a matter of days. Today that seems like it would take forever. But back then, if you think about how long it would have taken you to get in a covered wagon and to cover that distance from, say, New York or even western Pennsylvania all the way to California, it would have taken months and months and months on end, and you were probably going to die of dysentery along the way. By increasing the movement of people and the movement of ideas, the railway helped to eradicate regional differences in dialects. It helped to create larger nations that were increasingly homogeneous, or that at least shared a common culture, in the way in which, say, the United States didn't share a common culture in the 1830s and the 1840s. Yes, there was the United States, but the United States was a very different country depending upon what region of the country you lived in. If you lived in New England, Maine, and Vermont, one thing. If you lived in the Mid-Atlantic or down in the Deep South in Dixie, you experienced a different America, completely different. Obviously, in the slaveholding South, it's different than the free North, although racial attitudes are strong in both areas. The railway is going to contribute here to the homogenization, the coming together of an entire country and continent in the American case. It's also going to introduce and bring together different kinds of people. People who normally would not have associated with one another, save for the fact that now, even if they were not riding on the same cars, they were at least taking part in using the same transportation. This is Honoré Daumier's The Third Class Carriage from 1864. And it's a really interesting work of art, if only because it takes as its subject people who normally 25, 35, 40 years earlier would probably not have been the subject of a major artistic work. The downtrodden lower classes of the urban setting. Here they are riding in their third-class carriage. Peasants coming in from the countryside, laborers on their way to work, perhaps, a breastfeeding peasant or working-class mother. Here they all are on the third-class carriage. This represented something that was relatively new to European sensibilities. Okay. The coming together of the high and the low within now this new confined social setting of the railway. Bringing together city and countryside, blurring the distinction of the urban-rural divide. The other thing that the railroad introduced was a new sense of time, space, and motion. Sensations that were rooted, of course, in speed and velocity. Sensations that literally had never before been felt by humans. These are going to be made possible by rapidly moving railroad transport and its extension to larger and larger areas of the continent. One of the curious things about the 19th century from the standpoint of technology, a European citizen who had experienced transportation on the continent, say in 1805 or 1806, probably never traveled more than about 10 or 15 miles an hour on a trotting horse. And if you talk succinctly in terms about the ordinary travel you would undertake on a day-to-day basis, you probably never traveled more than about 5 or 6 miles an hour, which is about the speed of a horse walking. And this is the way, I mean, if you can walk on your own 2 legs, of course, you're not going to travel much more than 5 or 6 miles an hour. Try it. Okay. How far could you travel? How far could you go? So that's the beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, people could travel upwards of 60, 70, or even 80 miles an hour aboard a fast-moving locomotive. Time, the sense of time, and with it the sense of space and distance now, was being compressed. It didn't take quite as long. The distance was still the same if you measured it along the road, but it took much less time to make the travel from Paris out to the countryside, or from the countryside into Paris, or even from different places across the country, now that you had railways. And this sense of dynamism, this growing sense of the differentiation of time and space, also heightened awareness of the ability of humankind to impose order on the natural world. This is also going to advance in its own way the growing detachment of individuals from nature. If you think about the ideal railway bed, it's hard, level surface. It's straight. You don't lay railways out. You don't lay the tracks sympathetically with the landscape. You don't go over the mountain or over the hill. You go through it. You either blow it up and carve a giant rut through it, or you carve a tunnel into the side of the mountain. Okay? Because in order for the railway to function properly, it needs to be on a level surface, or a surface as close to level as possible. You don't want to go this way and that, diagonally and crossways the way that maybe a horse cart or a horse path may have been laid out. You want to go in a straight line. Nothing gets in the way of a speeding locomotive. Not a river, not a mountain, not a canyon. You bridge the rivers, you cut through the mountains, you bridge the canyons. Nature, in the process, of course, is being tamed. It's being disciplined by the technology and by the engineers, the construction engineers, the civil engineers who are coming out to undertake the construction of these rail lines. What do you see when you're on a train? Or, if it helps, what do you see when you're in an automobile, if you're not driving, if you're in the passenger seat? What these folks saw in the 1850s and the 1860s, riders of these straight speeding bullets saw nothing but a disorienting sight, the landscape shooting past them quickly. So quickly it's difficult to focus on. The train would create a barrier between the rider and the landscape, making a detached view of an untouchable scene. The traveler on the train perceived the landscape as it was filtered through this machine-like ensemble. And that's the message that we give, that's communicated in part in J.M.W. Turner's very famous painting from 1844, Rain, Steam, Speed, the Great Western Railway. A great work of the Romantic period from 1844. You see this locomotive coming in almost out of the fog, whizzing towards you from out back, while in the background you've got these 2 guys in a boat sitting here in a static fashion. Here are some horses or cows grazing in the fields. Here is the railway car moving towards you. Even the title of it, Rain, Steam, Speed, suggests this idea of movement, a new sensation. What was taking place by the 1850s and the 1860s was the mechanization of daily life. The mechanization of daily life. Machines, technology were coming to be part and parcel of the everyday urban landscape. There was also a new aesthetic that was emerging. It was a new architectural vision that was dominated now by iron and glass. And there was no better example of this architectural aesthetic than the railway station itself. Here's a painting from 1862, William Powell Frith's The Great Railway Station, showing you once again the bustle of all humanity crowding into the trains. We looked at Daumier's third-class carriage earlier. The railroad was the first industrial object in history with which everyone came into contact. Not everybody sailed on a steamship. Not everybody sailed on a steamship because those steam passengers can be very, very expensive. But in time, almost everybody is going to ride, if not on a railway car across the country, at least onto a train that's going to carry you into a suburban location. The railway affected the rich and the low-born. It affected statesmen and citizens alike. It brought together people from all walks of life and from every social strata to the stations, to the cars that carried them across the surface of the earth. The impact of the railway, of course, is not limited to the United States and Europe. In time, it's going to extend across the steppes of Asia, penetrate into the jungles of Africa, crisscross the mountains and valleys of the Indian subcontinent. It's going to bind people together, bringing different religions and races into contact, hastening the spread of European civilization across the globe. Along with the railway, another important technology of the mid-century was the telegraph, which sent electronic signals over wires that transmitted messages across very, very far distances. 1832 is typically the year that is credited with the invention of the telegraph, or at least with the discovery, I should say, that an electric signal could be transmitted by a piece of wire. A British inventor by the name of Sir Charles Wheatstone would work as well on the telegraph. The name that is most synonymous with it in the American standpoint is this fellow, Samuel Morse, whose contribution to the spread of the telegraph as an invention was to invent a code consisting of dots and dashes, or short and long electrical signals. This is the breakthrough that would actually lead to the transmission of messages over the wires. You knew that you could send an electrical signal, but what to make of it? What Morse did is he put together the dots and dashes into what we know, of course, as Morse code. This new means of communication meant that you could almost instantaneously send a message across great, great distances. Now, you had to lay the wires, you had to have the telegraph stations, you had to have sending and receiving machines on both ends. But once the transmission wires and relay stations were constructed, information and news could travel faster than at any time in human history up to that point. And we've already seen the impact of this as it had an effect on Russia in 1855 and 1856 during the Crimean War. It's the British and French ability to lay telegraph lines almost all the way up to the front lines of the conflict in the Crimea that enabled the British and the French to achieve such a great strategic advantage over the Russians, who were sending their messages to and from St. Petersburg to the Crimea via overland courier. Time and space have been now compressed. You can get a message from the siege of Sevastopol in 1855 to London or to Paris in a matter of maybe 4 or 5 hours, and then receive your instructions back from that dispatch. So here we see Europe, we see the fruits of European and Western invention really coming to alter and to change the way in which individuals and folks are going to interact with the world around them. The high point of European culture at mid-century comes between the 1st of May and the 15th of October, 1851. It comes in the form of something known as the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. It's held in London, England. This is the predecessor to what is going to become a series of enormous World's Fairs. These are going to be cultural fixtures of the second half of the 19th century. The Great Exhibition was organized under the sponsorship of Prince Albert and something known as the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. What it aimed to do was to bring in examples of industry and arts and commerce and production from all over the globe into an exhibit hall specially built for this purpose. The exhibit is intended to be a display of the works of all nations. All nations. But its true function was really an expression of the growing domination of the West, Western Europe, and specifically the British in this new emerging industrialized era. Almost 100,000 different objects were on display. Of those, nearly half came from the United Kingdom or its colonies. Among the works on display at the Great Exhibition, massive hydraulic lifts that could raise more than 1,100 tons, steam hammers that could forge the main bearing of a steamship, or with equal precision, gently crack an egg. Printing presses capable of generating 5,000 issues of a periodical in less than an hour. Newfangled adding machines, a wide assortment of consumer and domestic devices, all testifying here to the wonders of British industry. Machine tools, steam engines, industrial products from the United States, France, and German manufacturers were also on display. This was a show. It was a show of ingenuity, a show of technological prowess. The items that were on display within the exhibit hall attracted a great deal of attention, and millions would show up to see this during the period it was open from the 1st of May to mid-October 1851. But it wasn't simply the displays themselves that attracted so much attention. The building in which all of these things were housed, generated every bit as much public interest as the items within it. The building was designed by a greenhouse constructor named Joseph Paxton. It was 1,851 feet long, 456 feet wide, and it enclosed a total of 18 acres of London's Hyde Park within a massive edifice formed from close to 250,000 prefabricated glass panes and tens of thousands of cast iron columns and girders. This was a prefabricated building, which is itself made it an engineering marvel of sorts for that particular time. The building was tall enough to enclose fully mature trees, and in fact it's built around fully mature trees that are in Hyde Park. But it was free of interior walls. Most of it is open. It's an open space, okay, with support beams, but then you have these very long halls that enable, if we go back to that photograph from the interior of the exhibit, you can see here how the interior of this thing is really wide open. It doesn't have the thick masonry walls that are necessary to buttress it to keep the ceiling up or anything along those lines. It was dubbed, the building was, the Crystal Palace by Punch magazine. And the Crystal Palace itself was an engineering marvel. It was designed to be quickly erected and disassembled. So it's not only is it a prefabricated building, it's designed to be a temporary building. Those cast iron hollow members that serve as upright supports also serve simultaneously as drainage devices, kind of like your gutters would, so that you can get the water off the roof of it. The building would prove to be so popular that as the exhibition was winding down and they were getting ready to disassemble the so-called Crystal Palace, public outpouring demanded that the thing be disassembled and then reassembled elsewhere in London. So they take it down from Hyde Park and they rebuild it at a place called Sydenham in the London suburbs, and it's going to last until 1936 when it's destroyed in a fire. So the Crystal Palace comes to be seen as a symbol of the industrial and technological advances of Europe by the middle of the 19th century. The machines, and the Crystal Palace is in a way, it's a machine of its own sort. These machines came to be seen really as the highest achievement of the human mind. And with new technological advances, the spread of the railroads, the increasing size of steamships, the development of telegraphs and new technologies, increasingly European thinkers became convinced that the scientific method, that technological approaches could be applied to resolving any matter of problems. From the problems posed by poverty and inequality to the quest for a better understanding of the past. There's no better example of this than a French thinker by the name of Auguste Comte, who devises a new philosophy he calls positivism. Positivism, that regards science really as the quintessential achievement of all of humanity. He embraces a very optimistic faith in science and technology, and with this reflects emerging European and American attitudes. If science and technology are the high points of human achievement, well then obviously those nations, those cultures that master science and technology represent the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. This kind of faith grows apace as the scale and complexity of inventions reach levels never before seen. The unfolding social, cultural, and economic revolutions occasioned by railroads and steamships, telegraphs, and transoceanic cables together with a host of other systems and inventions, from mass production with interchangeable parts, gaslighting, photography. All of this gives Europe and the United States a look and a feel that is now profoundly different than any other time before. It's by the middle of the 19th century that Western civilization is beginning to distinguish itself in a material sense from anything that has ever come before it. And it's going to reinforce notions in the popular mindset among the literate public in the West and in the United States that technology is the foundation of human progress and the chief measure of national greatness. Now, these kinds of ideas are going to be institutionalized as well. You could transmit culture and progress via the railroad, via the telegraph, via the steamship. These are vehicles, obviously, for moving people and moving ideas. But there are other institutional vehicles for the mobilization of civic and moral energies. And there's going to be a call as part of this general embrace of positivism by the middle of the 19th century for moral improvement. And this is in the midst of the Victorian age in England, this idea that one's moral stature was reflected in the works that one undertook. This could be extended as well to nations as a whole. There are two institutions that begin to thrive in Europe and in the United States by the middle of the 19th century. One of these is the press, the illustrated press. There is an enormous growth in the newspaper and journal industries during the third quarter of the 19th century. This really is the age of the mass publication journal, the mass publication newspaper. In Berlin, in Prussia, by 1862, there were 32 newspapers and 58 weeklies. In Berlin, 32 newspapers and 58 weeklies in 1862. By the end of the 1870s, Germany alone had more than 2,400 different newspapers. So this is the result here, the belated result of the printing revolution of Gutenberg, right? This thing is spread now everywhere. You have mass circulation newspapers. Newspapers would become more and more widespread. They would appear more frequently. And they were now, because of the telegraph, able to deliver news more quickly than ever before. And as a result of these changes, the press was increasingly important in shaping public opinion. The ideas that one gathered, the ideas that one formed, were coming in large part by not one's direct encounter with many of these technologies, but in some cases, how one read about them in the newspaper or in the journal. Now, across Europe, these types of publications are still subject to levels of governmental interference. Less governmental interference in Britain. There are also as of yet no established professional standards. Very few of the newspapers in the 1850s and the 1860s have full-time correspondents. They're receiving stories that are being written and submitted voluntarily. But what newspapers are doing by the 1850s and the 1860s, both in London, in Berlin, in Paris, and in New York, they're devoting increasing attention and space to so-called respectable and enlightened topics. They're talking about economics and culture. They're reporting on the opening of museum exhibitions, new scientific discoveries, scholarly conferences. I mean, goodness gracious, there's even a time in American history and European history, you go back to newspapers like the London News, Illustrated London News, or the Times of London, the 1850s, the 1860s, you'll see stories written about a professor's inaugural lecture. There's a new professor at Cambridge, and here's his inaugural lecture. Okay, to give people an opportunity to become enlightened and to become educated. Major big city newspapers were conveying a message that what was undergoing was a period of material, intellectual, and moral improvement. And that as the technological and scientific foundations of European culture were raising, so too were the moral values and the outlook of European inhabitants. Along with newspapers, illustrated weeklies would prove to be immensely popular publications and immensely influential publications as well. They would be present in all of the European states. If you're familiar at all with the British case, the illustrated weekly Punch is among the most famous. And if you got nothing else to do later tonight or tomorrow, just Google Punch Britain, 19th century. You can call up the cartoons and essays. A lot of these things are digitized now. They're available online. Gartenlaube, and that's what I'm showing you here, is a German publication. Gartenlaube was founded in 1853. Within 7 years of its founding, it had a circulation of 100,000. That's a mass circulation press. It's getting out the news to 100,000 people each week. By 1860, so 1853, when it's first established, it has a circulation of 100,000. Within 7 years, its circulation has increased to 400,000. By 1880, within 27 years of its founding, it had a readership of perhaps 2 million people per issue. What did it write? Well, what you found in Die Gartenlaube were articles on steam engines and magnetism, descriptions of how mechanical plows worked, or the physiology of the screech owl, recent advances in agriculture, new breakthroughs in science and industry. The weekly journals reflected the growing omnipresence of scientific and technological developments around the continent. There were other cheap versions of these. Joseph Mayer's Penny Library is an example. These were small books that were written, that were very cheap, that circulated in large numbers, because what you have in Europe and the United States by this time is a growing literate population. And that growing literate population wants things to do. They want forms of entertainment, but they also want types of entertainment that are going to be edifying, that are going to teach them something about the world around them. This is all part of that positivist movement that develops in mid-century. The other major institution alongside of the periodicals and newspapers that is so important at the middle of the 19th century are things known as voluntary associations. Voluntary associations. These too would help spread the growing gospel of technological and scientific progress and of moral progress. Voluntary associations had been around for decades. You've got associations devoted to pretty much any kind of a cause or any kind of a hobby that you can think of. Associations for gymnasts and singers, associations for doctors and that type of thing. But from the 1840s on, there was a growing passion for associations and an absolute expanse in their number. This is particularly true in Germany. By 1870, almost half of all citizens belonged to at least one voluntary association of one kind or another. It might be an association devoted to bringing literacy to the poor, or to collecting medical supplies for the indigent. It might be a voluntary association devoted to sponsoring and supporting a local museum, or sponsoring local libraries. The idea was you were engaged in some way in a civic activity that contributed to the growth and the development of your community as a whole. These are the attitudes, these are the things that are going on in Western Europe and in the United States during this period. The Russians in the 1850s and the 1860s are dealing not only, of course, with news that is coming from abroad about these various and sundry developments. I don't want to go there yet. About these various and sundry developments. They're also, of course, dealing with the transformations that are underway in Russia itself. I want to talk now about an aspect of Russian development at mid-century that is peculiar to Russia and that ties into some of the things that we've already seen with our Westernizers and our Slavophiles. If you recall our discussion back 2 weeks ago about the origins of the intelligentsia in the 1830s and the 1840s, you may recall me mentioning that by the 1830s and the 1840s, educated opinion in Russia had already arrived at a general consensus concerning the country's progress to date and its future prospects. At the heart of this vision was the basic cultural assumption that industrialization after the European model came with dangers, and that there were some native alternatives to that developmental model that might be superior. There's also, along with this, a growing certainty, patriotic certainty among some, that despite the fact that Russia is backward vis-a-vis the West, Russia would somehow manage to transcend its past and become one of the world's most advanced nations. It would leap over the West in terms of development. And this is true whether you're a Westernizer or a Slavophile. Even the most conservative Slavophile admired the products of Western ingenuity. How could you not? How could you not look at a speeding locomotive and just be awed at what you saw? Even the most conservative admired the products of Western ingenuity and desired to appropriate them to improve Russia. But even the most liberal Westernizer resented, in part, European advances and saw those advances as material proof that despite Russia's own considerable achievements, impoverished Russia was still backward, and it was still inferior in certain ways. Both Slavophiles and Westernizers defined existing industrial society as an anti-model. Neither the Westernizers nor the Slavophiles wanted to embrace entirely Western progress. They had in mind an ideal image of Russia in their heads, and that is what they wanted to create. Some of the intelligentsia would place their hope in teaching and tutoring the masses. Others, like Herzen, those teaching and tutoring the masses, the Slavophiles, right? You're going to teach the peasants in this patriarchal fashion how to be educated. But others, like Herzen, are going to embrace the natural socialism of the peasant commune. Whatever the case, both the Slavophiles and the Westernizers are looking to find a special path for Russia out of all of this. And that's what is important to remember about our Westernizers and our Slavophiles. There are superficial differences between the two, but they share a common cultural inheritance. They're drawn overwhelmingly from the ranks of the well-to-do gentry. They have a faith in Russia's youth, dating back to Romanticism. They desire political and social arrangements different from those that exist in Russia, the autocratic state of Nicholas I. And both are going to conclude that overcoming lingering backwardness required morals and methods that were different from the West. And there's another aspect about these intelligenti, like Herzen, Kireevsky, Botkin. Most of these folks have no direct knowledge or experience with technical, scientific, or industrial enterprises. They are not themselves engineers. They are not themselves technicians. They don't really understand how these things work. And what we're going to see emerge in Russia as a result in the 1860s and the 1870s, Russian thinkers are going to tend to embrace ideology and ideas at the expense of practical considerations. This is going to drive much of Russian intellectual history. And there's another important aspect here. The Russians lack in the 1840s and the 1850s what I would call intermediary corporate bodies that can leverage practical knowledge to secure incremental change. Those voluntary associations that are emerging in the United States, that are emerging in Europe in the 1830s and the 1840s, there are very, very few in Russia, very few corresponding to anything like what you have in the West, although we're going to see they're going to begin to emerge in the aftermath of the emancipation of the serfs. How do you go about transforming Russia? How do you go about realizing this change? No small part of it is going to have to do, once again, with the state coming in, providing the incentive, providing the impetus for the creation of what comes to be known as a knowledge economy. Something that emerges in the West. It's part and parcel of this positivist movement of the 1840s and the 1850s. How is it that someone like Comte or someone like Paxton or the engineers that we've encountered from time to time, how are they able to undertake to learn and to invent? Because they have available access to scientific and technological publications, many of them geared to general readers. Think Popular Mechanics in the United States. You're going to see the emergence gradually of a network of research-oriented universities, the establishment of independent scientific societies, professional associations. doctors' associations, archaeologists' associations, legal associations. These types of institutions, voluntary associations and professional associations, are going to rapidly accelerate in the West in the 1830s, the 1840s, and the 1850s. And as they do, they accelerate the production of theoretical knowledge and its transformation into applied techniques. The Russians don't yet quite have these things. How are the Russians going to begin building them? They're going to begin building them largely in the aftermath of emancipation, and largely as a result of the continuation of that state policy that I introduced 2 weeks ago called glasnost, or openness, under Alexander II.